What you're about to witness is perhaps the most electrifying collision of arrogance and authority ever to unfold inside a courtroom. It began as an ordinary morning in Providence Municipal Court, but it would become a lesson in humility so powerful that law enforcement academies would one day teach it as a case study. The incident began quietly, almost too quietly, before erupting into a confrontation that would expose the sharp difference between enforcing the law and understanding it. The man at the center of it all was a 38-year-old police sergeant named Derek Thompson. To anyone who met him, he appeared to be the very image of disciplined authority: neatly trimmed hair, crisp uniform, polished badge, and the air of a man who had spent his adult life giving orders, not taking them. But beneath the spotless surface was a deep, rooted belief that his position placed him a step above ordinary citizens. And on this particular morning he would learn just how wrong that belief was. The date was April 5th. The time, and 10:45 a.m. Judge Frank Caprio, known throughout Rhode Island for his calm demeanor and razor-sharp sense of justice, was halfway through his docket. The atmosphere in the courtroom was familiar. The low shuffle of papers, the murmur of attorneys, the occasional nervous laugh from a first-time offender. But when the doors opened and Derek Thompson entered, something shifted. It wasn't the sound of his boots or the jingle of his keys that turned heads. It was the attitude that came with him. He walked with deliberate confidence, chin lifted slightly, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward as though the courtroom were merely another briefing room under his command. He didn't remove his hat. He didn't nod respectfully to the bench. Instead, he stopped at the defendant's table and rested one hand on his duty belt, a gesture more suited to a police interview than a courtroom appearance. To most in attendance, it was subtle. To Judge Caprio, it spoke volumes. Thompson was not there because of a crime. He was there because of a parking ticket, one issued 3 weeks earlier outside a restaurant called Tony's. The citation was simple: parking in a handicapped space while off duty. For any ordinary citizen, it was a $300 fine and a mild embarrassment. For Thompson, it was, in his words, an administrative misunderstanding. He believed that his badge, even when off duty, offered a certain flexibility when it came to the rules that governed civilians. The judge looked up from his file. "Officer Derek Thompson," the clerk announced. Thompson took one step forward, arms stiff at his sides. "Sergeant," he corrected automatically. The judge's eyebrow lifted slightly. The first hint of tension. "Sergeant Thompson," Caprio repeated evenly. "You're charged with parking in a handicapped space while off duty, in violation of City Ordinance 127. The violation occurred on March 15th, at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. How do you plead?" Thompson's answer came smoothly, like a man used to reciting procedures. "Not guilty, Your Honor. I believe the citation represents a fundamental misapplication of parking enforcement policies as they relate to sworn law enforcement personnel." Several heads in the gallery turned. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. His tone carried the kind of superiority that suggested he wasn't merely defending himself, but educating the court on what he believed to be the proper understanding of the law. Judge Caprio slowly set down his pen. "Were you on duty at the time?" "No, Your Honor," Thompson replied. "But as a sworn police officer, I maintain certain responsibilities that require flexible interpretation of civilian parking restrictions. I was prepared to respond to any situation requiring police intervention." The room fell silent. Even those unfamiliar with court proceedings sensed the arrogance in his words. "Sergeant," Caprio asked quietly, "were you responding to an emergency?" Thompson hesitated for the briefest moment before saying, "Not at that specific moment, Your Honor, but readiness is part of the job." Caprio leaned back slightly in his chair. "I see. Can you cite any statute or regulation, state, municipal, or departmental, that exempts off-duty officers from handicap parking restrictions?" The sergeant's confidence faltered. "Your Honor, with all due respect, police operational protocols supersede municipal ordinances in certain contexts. Any experienced officer would understand that." There it was, the fatal phrase. With all due respect. It never meant respect. It always signaled defiance. The judge's pen tapped softly against the desk. "So your position," Caprio said slowly, "is that your badge allows you to disregard parking laws while off duty?" "Not disregard," Thompson replied, his irritation now showing. "Interpret. I've been enforcing these laws for 15 years. I think I understand their intent better than someone who only sees them from behind the bench." A murmur rippled through the gallery. A courtroom officer shifted uneasily. Even the clerk glanced nervously toward the judge. Thompson had done it. He had insulted the very foundation of the courtroom, the authority of the bench itself. Caprio's glasses came off. It was a small movement, but everyone who had ever appeared before him knew what it meant. Something important and irreversible was about to happen. "Sergeant Thompson," Caprio began, "let me make sure I understand. You are asserting that your 15 years of enforcing traffic laws give you greater authority to interpret them than this court does?" Thompson, failing to recognize the precipice before him, nodded. "I'm simply stating that practical enforcement gives a more realistic understanding of the law than academic interpretation. The judge nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then perhaps you can assist the court with your expertise. You're a traffic division supervisor, are you not? Yes, Your Honor, Thompson said, pride creeping back into his voice. Which means you supervise officers who issue citations for parking violations. Yes, Your Honor. And in your role, how do you instruct those officers to handle off-duty personnel who park illegally in handicapped spaces? Thompson hesitated. We handle each case based on its context. That's not what I ask. Caprio replied. Do you tell them off-duty police are exempt from handicap parking laws? The sergeant shifted uncomfortably. No, Your Honor, so there is no exemption. No, Your Honor. Then Caprio said softly, your argument is that you personally are entitled to an exemption your department does not recognize. The silence was absolute. Thompson swallowed hard. I believe discretion. Sergeant, Caprio interrupted, his tone no longer gentle. You are not exercising discretion. You are standing before a court, arguing that you are above the law. The color drained from Thompson's face. But the judge wasn't finished. Since you've questioned this court's understanding of law enforcement, Caprio continued, I reviewed your department's manual. Section 4.2.3 explicitly states that off-duty officers are required to comply with all civilian laws and ordinances. Were you aware of that? Thompson stared at the floor. Yes, Your Honor. And according to your internal affairs file, you've received 2 previous reprimands for what your supervisors termed abuse of authority. One of them specifically mentions your belief that police status exempts you from civilian regulations. Is that correct? Thompson's voice dropped to a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. Caprio nodded gravely. Then today's conduct is not an isolated incident. It's a continuation of behavior that your own department has already identified as problematic. The sergeant's confidence was gone, replaced by the realization that his entire career was unraveling before him. Sergeant Thompson, Caprio said, voice steady and deliberate, you came into my courtroom believing your uniform made you untouchable. You insulted this court's understanding of the law, attempted to use your position as leverage, and demonstrated a dangerous misunderstanding of authority. Therefore, I am not only finding you guilty of the parking violation and imposing the full fine, but I am also holding you in contempt for your disrespectful conduct. The gasps echoed through the courtroom. The judge's next words would seal the sergeant's fate. A full transcript of this hearing will be sent to the Providence Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, along with my recommendation that you receive additional training in legal compliance and that your fitness for supervisory duties be reviewed. Thompson's voice cracked. Your Honor, please, you can't. Caprio raised a hand. Sergeant, I'm not destroying your career. You did that the moment you decided your badge was greater than the law it represents. He leaned forward, voice soft but sharp as glass. In my 45 years of practicing law, I've learned that the most dangerous officer is not the one who makes mistakes, but the one who believes he cannot make them. Respect for the law is not a favor you grant others. It is the discipline you owe yourself. The room was utterly still. Your $300 fine is now $800 with court costs. You are fined an additional $500 for contempt. You may step down. Thompson stood motionless, eyes downcast. For the first time in his career, he looked small, just another man before the bench. When the gavel fell, the sound was final. But outside those walls, the story was only beginning. Within hours, someone had uploaded the courtroom footage to the internet. By that evening, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Law enforcement officers debated it across forums. Civilians hailed it as a triumph of judicial balance. And inside the Providence Police Department, quiet conversations began about what it meant for their own. Captain Maria Rodriguez, Thompson's direct superior, had been sitting in the back of the courtroom that morning. As the spectators dispersed, she approached him carefully. Derek, she said quietly, that judge just showed you more grace than you realize. You should take it. He nodded weakly, clutching the folded citation like a relic of his own downfall. Outside, reporters swarmed him asking questions he didn't answer. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, some sympathetic, others less so. By midnight, millions had seen him lose not just a case but his composure, his pride, and perhaps his career. The next morning, Internal Affairs opened a formal review. They cited unprofessional conduct before a judicial authority and misrepresentation of departmental authority. Within 2 weeks, Thompson was temporarily removed from his supervisory position pending investigation. His commanding officers debated whether he should face disciplinary suspension. For the first time in 15 years, Derek Thompson had no one to command, no badge-fueled authority to shield him, and no illusion of superiority to hide behind. The investigation into Sergeant Derek Thompson's conduct began swiftly and quietly, but the silence that followed was far heavier than any public reprimand. Within 48 hours of the courtroom confrontation, his commanding officer, Captain Maria Rodriguez, received an official notice from Internal Affairs requesting a full account of Thompson's record, including disciplinary actions, performance evaluations, and supervisory reports. The judge's recommendation, accompanied by the hearing transcript, had been received and reviewed in full. Every word of Thompson's defiance, every instance of arrogance, and every moment of humiliation was preserved on record, not just for legal documentation, but as evidence of a mindset incompatible with leadership. Thompson arrived at headquarters that Monday morning still wearing his uniform, but it no longer carried the same weight. Officers who had once greeted him with casual respect now looked away. The department's atmosphere was thick with quiet judgment. The video of his exchange with Judge Caprio had already circulated through internal networks. Some watched it with discomfort, others with grim satisfaction. Thompson had been known for his rigid demeanor, his tendency to overstep authority, and his belief that enforcement always trumped empathy. For years, whispers had circulated that his leadership style reflected more intimidation than inspiration. He walked into Captain Rodriguez's office with a stiffness that felt more like armor than confidence. She gestured for him to sit. "Derek," she began softly, "you understand why we have to go through this process?" He nodded silently. The department can't ignore what happened in that courtroom. The judge's words were clear and public. This isn't about a parking ticket anymore. It's about whether you understand what your badge represents. Her tone was firm but not cruel. She had known him for years, knew his strengths, his commitment, and also his flaws. "Internal Affairs wants a written statement from you by the end of the day," she said. "They're reviewing your conduct under the professional standards policy, and they're evaluating your fitness for supervisory duty." Thompson stared at the desk. "Captain, I made a mistake. I didn't mean to disrespect the court. She raised her hand gently. "Derek, this isn't the first time someone's told you your attitude is a problem. You've been warned before. In reviews, in counseling sessions, in your disciplinary reports. The difference this time is that you didn't argue with another officer or a civilian. You argued with the law itself." Her words landed like a sentence of their own. That evening, he wrote his statement. It was 3 pages long, defensive at first, then remorseful near the end. He admitted poor judgment, acknowledged his tone, and expressed regret for his own professional demeanor. But the words felt hollow even as he typed them. He knew that written apologies couldn't erase video evidence watched by millions. By the end of the week, the department's internal review board convened. 5 senior officers and 1 civilian advisor sat in a semicircle across from him. The transcript of the courtroom exchange lay open before them. For over an hour, they questioned him about his comments, his understanding of departmental policy, and his perception of judicial authority. "Sergeant," one of the board members asked, "do you understand why Judge Caprio considered your behavior contemptuous?" "Yes, sir," Thompson replied quietly. "Do you understand why this department considers it a violation of professional ethics?" "Yes, sir." "Then explain it to us." Thompson hesitated. For the first time, he didn't have a ready answer. He glanced at the transcript, his own words staring back at him like a mirror he could no longer avoid. "Because," he said slowly, "I acted as though my badge gave me more power than the law itself. I thought being a police officer meant I could interpret the law to fit my role, not obey it like everyone else. I was wrong." There was no applause, no sigh of relief, only the quiet scratch of pens as his words were recorded. 2 weeks later, the decision came demotion. Thompson would be stripped of his sergeant's rank and reassigned to patrol duty. He would undergo mandatory retraining, 40 hours of coursework in constitutional law, ethics, and civilian relations. His pay was reduced, and his record was marked with a disciplinary note that would remain for 5 years. He was placed on a 1-year probationary period, during which any further misconduct could result in termination. When the notice was handed to him, he didn't argue. He simply nodded and signed. For the next several months, Derek Thompson wore his badge differently. The polished shine remained, but the pride behind it was gone. He no longer barked orders or corrected subordinates with condescending authority. Instead, he listened. He asked questions. He began to see what he had refused to before. That authority was not granted by a uniform, but earned through restraint, fairness, and humility. His retraining course began at the Rhode Island Police Academy, where he sat among younger recruits barely half his age. On the first day, an instructor played a video on professional accountability. It was the same courtroom clip, his courtroom clip. The recruits watched intently, unaware that the man in the back of the room, head bowed, was the officer from the screen. When the lights came on, the instructor said, "This is what happens when pride replaces principle. Respect isn't demanded, it's demonstrated." No one spoke. Thompson stared at the floor, his chest tight with regret. It was the most painful lesson of his career, but also the most necessary. 6 months passed. His reputation, once dominated by arrogance, began to shift. He took extra shifts, volunteered for community outreach programs, and treated citizens with a patience that surprised even his former critics. His fellow officers noticed the change. Some teased him at first, but the mockery faded as they saw his sincerity. Then, one crisp October morning, a familiar summons arrived on his desk, a notice to appear once again before Judge Frank Caprio. It wasn't a disciplinary summons this time. It was a court proceeding for another minor traffic-related case he'd been assigned to handle as a witness. He arrived early, wearing a plain patrol uniform, cap in hand. The courtroom looked exactly as it had months earlier, but this time he entered differently, quietly, respectfully, with no trace of swagger. When Judge Caprio saw his name on the docket, a faint smile crossed the judge's face. "Officer Thompson," the clerk announced. Thompson stepped forward, standing tall but humble. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "before we proceed, I'd like to say something, if the court permits." Caprio nodded. "Go ahead, officer." Thompson took a breath. "I want to formally apologize for my behavior 6 months ago. I was arrogant, defensive, and disrespectful. Not just to you, but to what this court represents. I've learned a lot since then. I lost my rank, but I gained perspective. I understand now that the badge doesn't make me above the law. It binds me to it even more tightly. I'm grateful that you held me accountable. It forced me to see what I had become." The courtroom was silent. The judge regarded him with the same steady calm as before. "Officer Thompson," Caprio said softly, "your apology is accepted. True respect for the law isn't measured by how we act when we're right, but how we respond when we've been proven wrong. What you've learned will serve you better than any title or rank." Thompson nodded, his voice steady but low. "Thank you, Your Honor." What followed was not an overnight redemption but a gradual rebuilding. Over the next year, Thompson earned back his colleagues' trust. He became known not for commanding authority, but for mentoring younger officers in professionalism and ethics. When new recruits arrived, he would often tell them his story without naming names. He would say, "There was once a sergeant who thought his badge made him special. He forgot that authority without humility is just another form of weakness. The law doesn't bend for the badge. The badge exists because of the law." The recruits would listen quietly, unaware that the sergeant, in his story, had been him. By the time his probation ended, the department restored his good standing. Though he never asked for his rank back, the chief offered him a training officer position. Not because of his authority, but because of the wisdom he'd earned through humiliation and growth. Years later, the courtroom video was still circulating, studied by academies, analyzed in ethics seminars, discussed in leadership workshops. For civilians, it was a satisfying story of accountability. For police, it was a sobering reminder that integrity begins where ego ends. And for Derek Thompson, it was a turning point that redefined his entire understanding of service. He would later say during a law enforcement ethics seminar, "Judge Caprio didn't ruin my career. He rescued it. He taught me that respect for the law isn't just about obedience, it's about gratitude. The law is the reason we wear the badge, not the obstacle we overcome with it." Those who knew Judge Caprio weren't surprised. The old judge had a way of turning confrontation into education, humiliation into transformation. His courtroom wasn't merely a place for punishment. It was a classroom where even the proudest could learn. And so, the story of Sergeant Derek Thompson became more than a viral courtroom moment. It became a living parable about pride, authority, and redemption. Because, in the end, what destroyed Thompson's arrogance was not punishment, but perspective. What saved his career was not his badge, but his humility. And what Judge Caprio taught the world that day was a lesson that echoed far beyond Providence, that the measure of true authority lies not in the power to command, but in the willingness to submit, especially when the law reminds us that respect is not demanded by rank, but earned through conduct.